Welcome to the Edgevana Podcast, where we illuminate subjects in the IT infrastructure space. Get ready to hear some amazing insights from outstanding individuals that will change the way you think about IT. And now, here's your host, Mark Thiele.
Welcome to another edition of the Edgevana Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Thiele, and joining me today is a longtime friend from the IT space, a man who has accomplished way too much for his young age, and he really annoys me because of that. Ryan Fay, Global Head of High Tech and Global Enterprises at Gartner. Ryan has been leading voice in the IT community as a former CIO and top 30, under 30 IT leader. Ryan, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much. Really a pleasure to be here. Just a friendly reminder that everything I talk about today is just my own personal opinion. So looking forward to chatting, and thanks so much.
And I just got to say it again. It's really good to see you. Always good to catch up. And now that you're this super duper big shot at Gartner and stuff, we don't talk as much as we used to when you were only a CIO for a large growing company. But hopefully we can make up for a little bit of that today.
Absolutely.
So Ryan, tell us a little bit about what you're doing these days for people that are listening. A little bit about your background and what you do on a day-to-day basis for Gartner.
Yeah, absolutely, Mark. I appreciate it. Yeah, so it's interesting. I started my career in the networking side, and my background was in computer science. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do because I love networking, but I also love the computer science aspect of it. So believe it or not, none of those actually worked out, and I actually got recruited into the management side of things. And I led from that side into technology, moving into more of a global CIO roles. So I really love working on hard problems is what it was. And I just started solving hard problems with a lot of smart people. So from that perspective, just started combining forces, growing bigger, better teams, hiring great talent, and coming up with, net new solutions that really were able to scale to drive different value sets, just via our ecosystem. So from that perspective, I think for me, what I love doing and what I do on a daily basis is just partner with really smart, intelligent people, work on stuff that is normally difficult to solve for, and then focus on folks that are more mission driven and biased towards action. So that's mostly what I do on a daily basis.
No, that's awesome. I mean, and I still remember some of the conversations we had when you were thinking about your new role and the potential for the role at Gartner and how that fit into, what you're a combination of, a little bit about what you're worried about, but also what you're excited about. And sounds like from what we've talked about so far and what you're saying right now that at least so far, and it's been several years now, things are going well, and you're getting to work with those smart people, and you're getting to work with smart people on both sides of the coin, right? On the buy side of the coin, and on the sell side of the coin. So that's cool. That's exciting.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And I remember those days of us chatting about that role, and I think, it's been fun because it's one thing leading a practice and doing these things day to day. It's another thing about helping and coaching and essentially being able to partner with folks leading with data to actually understand what they should be doing. Yep. And for me, I think I'm in a pretty lucky position where I get to spend most of my day having conversations with my team, our clients, and close friends like yourself, and understanding, what are the different problems we're trying to solve for, and then seeing many different vantage points or viewpoints at once, which helps me then recognize patterns to better ask questions so that we can avoid repeating mistakes. And it's funny because I think a lot of people, they go into saying, oh, you want to fail fast, right? But I think if you have the right conversation, you can actually fail once, use those shared learnings to actually educate the rest of the folks, and then accelerate the pace of innovation, which really helps from not having to just fail over and over and over again, and just make sure you're doing the same checks with smart people to make sure you're doing the right things throughout the day.
It's funny. Two things that come out of what you said so far. First was that, like me, but unlike me, you discovered that regardless of what you thought you were going to do, management was where you decided to end up. For me, it was basically, I was like 7 years older than you when I decided to get into management, and maybe 5 or 6, but at least something like that. And I decided that I was never going to be the person that, to equivalent to you, I was never going to be the one that tore apart switches and routers and built networks in my house. For me, it would have been, I'm never going to tear apart servers and build my own email server. I'm not going to write my own DLLs. So if I'm not going to get to that level, then why am I going to continue to do PC and client server stuff? I might as well show that I'm at my level of intelligence and move on to to management where I can do even more damage, right? But for it's exciting to watch your career. It's you've done some amazing things, and it shows what having good focus, a great attitude and smart application can do for someone's career. And it actually highlights the variability and the optionality associated with being in the IT space, which is something that I don't think we talk about enough, generally speaking, right? Is that just because you got into data centers to start, or started working on PCs, or started pulling cable, it doesn't mean you're going to be a journeyman in 20 years and you'll be the best cable puller ever. You could be the CISO for the company, or the CIO or something, right, at some point. And so it's exciting stuff. And we taking that a step further, we've outlined a number of topics that we wanted to talk about today, and all of these are topical to my audience, and I think to a large number of the people that we generally interact with on Twitter, etc. And I don't think we're going to be able to get through all three of them. We talk a little bit about work from anywhere. We have a topic for edge computing in the enterprise and multi-cloud. I love all three of those subjects for different reasons. But I'm gonna go ahead and start in order. I'm gonna start with work from anywhere, see how far we get, and then we'll take a pick between edge computing and multi-cloud and go from there and see if we can get some decent coverage. So, Gartner, besides the fact that Gartner is a large enterprise in and of itself, you guys represent some of the largest enterprises in the world and provide analytics, intelligence, advice, services, etc. What can you tell us about what you're seeing without giving away things that Gartner doesn't want to hand out for free? What can you tell us about what you're seeing within Gartner and from some of the clients that you work with?
Yeah, it's a great question, Mark. I think it's funny because when we first went down this path of understanding, researching and giving advice on these different topics, from just being able to understand, work from anywhere, what does that mean to different people? You'll ask the same question to 4 different people and get 5 different answers, right? So honestly, it depends who you're talking to, the organization. Even the same folks in the same organization have different answers to what it means for them. So I think a lot of it is, for better or worse, a lot of CXOs have been given autonomy to reinvent the way that they work for whatever they see sustainable, to be able to be a hybrid model for them, to do the things that they need to be able to do, right? And a lot of it goes around a couple of key principles of being able to increase employee performance, attract, and retain talent more easily, but really be able to make sure that they're going to be able to have the right folks at the right time, the right place. Because in the past, there was always this, for lack of better words, convergence around a location. And that location has become much more agnostic now.
Yeah.
So what I can say from a lot of conversations, a lot of time and energy put into this topic, is that there's not a simple formula we can use or be followed when it comes to looking at this, at least not yet. And I think a successful hybrid work from home model should address, multiple kind of interlocking factors as we consider these. And a lot of it's going to depend on the industry and vertical that you're in. So I know from that perspective, there's probably 4 or 5 buckets of things that I can kind of walk through that we're seeing from a high level perspective on things that are making a difference. But happy to take this conversation wherever you think it makes the most sense to you and your listeners.
I agree with everything you just said. And, I have my own opinion of work from anywhere, which may or may not agree with yours exactly, or with half the people that you talk to. And, my basic, in fact, I came up with the notion of work from anywhere back in like late March of 2020, when we were first having this pandemic. And with the basic idea being that because it was when we first, it probably was more like April or May or something like that, when we first started hearing about companies that were like, I'm not going to renew the lease for our business, or, that kind of thing. We're not going to keep the offices in San Francisco or New York anymore, that kind of thing. I started thinking about the fact that historically we've all understood what working remote meant. And it usually meant that I'm traveling for work and I'm working from wherever I'm traveling to, or I get to work remotely, i.e. work from home occasionally, but it's under the understanding in general for most organizations that if something were to go wrong, I could be in my office in half an hour. I didn't need multiple monitors. I didn't need redundancy at my home office. I didn't need extra security precautions. I didn't need, a remote field support for PC support or something like that. because if something went wrong, I would go into the office, right? And that would be true whether it was for those kinds of problems or because you just need to meet with other people, right? But that changed. And that changed in the sense that you probably know some of these people, right? I know people, a good friend of mine works for one of the FANGs, senior leader there, I mean, VP level leader, and he lives out of a Airstream now.
Yeah.
At any given moment, he might be outside of a national monument or driving through the desert of New Mexico or something like that, and working from his trailer. And so working from anywhere, I felt was a better descriptor than just working from remote, and it brings a different set of challenges, right? So, and that leads me to my next question, and that's, I really want your feedback on this because I might be putting too much emphasis on it. Maybe it's not as important as I think it is. And that's that historically, when we've talked about work from remote, we've talked about people whose jobs are designed around the idea of being remote occasionally, even a major portion of their time, salespeople, consultants, business leaders, et cetera, where, I like to think I'm smart, but realistically, all I do is PowerPoints and email. Everybody else does the hard work, right? Yep. And I can do PowerPoints and email from a cabin in the woods if I need to, or from an airplane with bad Wi-Fi. But if I'm spending 5 to 8 hours a day in a relatively intensive business application as part of my job, that's a very, very different dynamic. Performance, security, data integrity, all of those things take on, at least in my opinion, take on a much more serious weight, right? So what are your thoughts on the work from anywhere and what IT leaders might need to accommodate to consider the fact that if we're going significantly beyond the traditional remote worker, what are some of the things we need to try to accommodate for those new kinds of workers, people that have more interaction with other employees on an hourly basis, or literally their productivity is measured by how many hours they spend on the ERP?
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I think that a few things. So I've hired a bunch of folks that have never even met the rest of the team in person because just the way we're interacting right now. And I think there's an art to science a bit of this, depending on how you're doing this and what it looks like. And it's probably going to kind of get back to the vertical industry and what you're working on. But the biggest thing I'm seeing, the biggest theme, if you will, is that before the pandemic, everything was largely designated around locations, to your point. And you would go to locations, you would have this normalization of that this is what we're going to be doing, and we're spending this many hours in the office. And folks that are remote, they always kind of felt a little bit like second tier folks that were remote. If you were in the office and you were in a meeting and someone was coming in on a Zoom call or whatever they were doing, there was never the same interaction or engagement because everybody in the room was having a separate conversation. You couldn't really hear that person that well. And people weren't really set up for that kind of environment, to your point. So I think there was the expectation that people that were working remote were working less than people in the office. I think what happened now is that as locations become more agnostic, right? You think about it almost like from a data center perspective. It's like, yeah, it matters from a latency perspective, where we're at, but from like a what's happening, what's going on perspective, it may not be as paramount as it was before. So I think it used to be the center of how work gets done. And now I think what we're seeing is that we're transitioning from a location-centric model to a human-centric model.
Right.
And now what's happening is we're putting the individual, the problem, the thing we're trying to solve at the center of work. And what we're actually seeing is if we do it correctly, we can actually get better flexibility, and that becomes the norm, not the exception. So when you do this, we're actually seeing better innovation, better speed, time to market type of stuff innovation. I think where we're running into problems is when there's those metric-driven jobs that you have to spend X amount of time doing these different things, checking in code, doing ERP type stuff. Like that's a little more hard to, I think, to wrap your head around when it comes to a fully remote environment. But I think it comes down to rethinking the workplace. And in reality, what does that workplace mean now during the pandemic? And what does it mean to have digital enablement during a pandemic?
Right.
And what's culture during a pandemic? I mean, a lot of FANG companies, they got by doing a lot of things, because the culture was, hey, you come in, you get a lot of free stuff, you get to stay here, and you get to do a lot of these different things. I know a lot of folks that have left Silicon Valley altogether because they're like, hey, one, I can go live somewhere cheaper. Two, I'm not going to the office anymore, so I'm not getting the same benefits I was getting. And a lot of these folks, they actually quit working at some of these FANG companies and went to go work for a new startup company because you're like, look, I'm getting better, kind of perks, if you will, remotely, because they were set up. These smaller companies were more set up for this kind of delivery because they were more virtual from the beginning. And they're getting more autonomy to be able to do what they need to do. So I think from that perspective, that the culture and the digital enablement are the big things. What does it mean? And I think to your point earlier, when you're talking about, how do you drive this type of stuff? And, in the past, you would be working on, PowerPoint on the road, or you could do this stuff from a cabin. I think we built up a lot of goodwill with our teams during the pandemic, right? As far as like having flexibility. I think the next question we're going to have to be kind of understanding or answering is, what does that mean long-term? Like, do we have the right tools, the right collaboration, the right facilities, from a remote work perspective? Also, how do we keep the momentum going? Because it's easy to do these sprints when it comes to getting these done. What we're realizing though is long-term, 18, 24, 36 months going on without any kind of interaction together as a team, it becomes much harder to keep that engagement going. Now, for some Fusion teams, doesn't matter as much because you're switching teams every 6 to 8 months. So it's a new iteration and kind of a new iteration. And we're seeing that as a better kind of workforce model for shifting talent too, is being able to have teams that are working on things that are more, I would say, near term and less future state things, which makes sense. But for some organizations, we're going to have a mix of both of those things as well too. So I think what it comes down to is, how do you do this in a future state, right? With, using AI and machine learning and all these different digital, type of automation tools we have. We also have this like gig economy coverage that's shortening some of the half-life of the skills and tasks we're having in our careers. Right. Also, I think people are to do more with their time now because they're not commuting, right? So they appreciate that, but they've also, I think people expect that time now. It's not a luxury anymore. It's, hey, we actually expect you to be doing more work during these times, right. For some organization, because we need to get more things done. So it's the reskilling, the upskilling, and maybe the kind of functionality, if you will, the market change, how to future-proof your employees and your enterprise, but mostly like, how do you do this in a way where you're still able to demand a premium for your service in a world where things are becoming more commoditized, because it's less about being in person and more about just delivering those skill sets that you need based on whatever it is, right? So I'll pause there because I said a lot of things, but I'm not sure if it makes sense or not, but that's where my head's at based on the question.
No, I think that was a great answer. And it is a detailed problem space, right? I mean, and you illustrated that. And no matter how much somebody like me might try to simplify it or dumb it down into, does that mean an employee gets 2 Macs or they use SASE at home? Mm-hmm. It is much more complex than that. And one of the things that you hinted at that I think I'd like to explore a little bit, and maybe we can wrap up the discussion about WFA at that point, is this notion of culture.
Yeah.
On the one hand, I've never been a fan of people who believe they can buy culture. Mm-hmm. By buying culture, meaning, oh, we've got foosball tables and we've got ping pong tables and we give people free candy bars and they get to get their laundry done in the office. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'd love those perks if I worked for a company that had those perks, but that's not a culture.
Yeah.
Right? And when you take the real culture, which is in my opinion, always led by senior executives of the company, generally speaking, starting with the CEO, right? How does that culture adapt? How does any culture adapt to, and is it even needed in the future where your workforce is so widely distributed? Does the idea of culture change significantly?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what we're seeing is a reforming of culture, right? And I think, every executive, for the most part, brings it up some point in time. Like, hey, we're worried about this working from home thing. It's really diluting our organizational culture. And therefore, we really need to get everybody back to the office, like ASAP, because our culture is going down, right? The reality, though, is that the main contributors to culture, value, mindset, and those practices that you mentioned earlier, what it really comes down to leadership. What we're seeing, and I think it's obviously, it makes sense, is that culture is not dependent on any location, but it's really a concerted effort of leadership focusing on human dimension of work, employee experience, all those things you were mentioning earlier, to be able to make sure that we have the right bandwidth and wherewithal for the team. Look, during COVID, some leaders, some executives, some CEOs, they had weekly, daily town halls with their team, and they had, things that they were doing, and they accelerated their culture because, like when my buddy works for a big company, he's like, yeah, our CEO was meeting with us on a daily basis in the beginning and telling us every day what was happening, what was going on. Like you can't replicate that, at scale in person, but you can do it very easily and very repeatedly in a virtual environment. So what we're actually seeing is that more flexible models actually support faster decision making. In reality, it creates more agile practices and less risk adverse culture. So the folks that are doing this well and they understand, to your point, it's a leadership thing, it's ability for me to be open, communicative, and again, the human dimension of work, the ability for the employee experience. If those things are still on point, I think culture is actually thriving for these companies, and they're actually able to have a lower, the barrier of entry maybe is easier right now because there's such a lack of that virtual culture that by doing some simple things, it goes a long way for, employees right now.
I think you made some great points there. And I think it's funny that maybe it's not funny, maybe it's sad that a lot of management, whether it's management that believes they need to keep more active eyeballs on employees because they're working remotely now where they weren't before, or managers who believe that the only way to keep the prisoners acting like prisoners is to keep them in the prison. Right. And I went ahead of the story there a little bit, but my basic sentiment is that if you're telling people they have to get away from what they like to do because you want them to have the culture that you believed existed before they started working remotely, that's sort of counterintuitive, right? It's like forcing somebody to do something just because you like it, not because they like it. And that's not a culture generally speaking, anybody wants to be a part of. So yeah, no.
The last thing I'll say just real quick is that you remind me of this, is that what we're seeing is that folks that are able to scale these skills, because to your point, the leadership skills and these skills becoming much more, I would say, expectations being lowered, right? Yeah. And what we're seeing is that because digital skills are, there's a command of premium right now increasingly. I think it's being, kind of pushed throughout all different roles. So more flexibility is actually attracting more top talent.
Right.
A hybrid workforce actually means that enterprises are able to hire, the best talent no matter where they live in the world, right? Yeah. Agnostic of being in a certain location. And then I think what we're seeing is that a hybrid work design requires, new skills, which leaders will have to actually enable the employees to learn on their own. There's not a lot of stuff already created for them. So the folks that are leading the pack, the apex leaders, they're the ones that are actually investing the time, energy, and money in creating, the different skills required for their teams. Right. And becoming the, generation 2.0 leader to be actually able to do these things in a digital presence. And I think that's where we're seeing the paradigm shift happen, is the ones that are focusing on this, investing the time, energy, and resources, they're seeing the gains already. And they've already seen the gains, the last 12 months. The ones that haven't, they're slowly, their attrition is obviously coming up, and they're not able to attract or retain the talent they were in the past because people are seeing, hey, this is actually a better option for me. And it's less about brand recognition and more about my ability to execute and get things done in a much more fast cadence. So
sort of like an accidental benefit and byproduct of digital transformation that most of us, you and I talked about digital transformation a lot before, and I don't think we ever once covered the idea of working from anywhere as part of digital transformation. It's not that if we hadn't tried to write a paper on it or something, we wouldn't have gotten to that point. Right. But I think, working from anywhere, it's just a natural byproduct of the whole notion of digitizing the business, including digitizing what used to be cubicles. Mm-hmm. In effect, that's what we're doing, right? Besides, everybody knows that cubicles don't work. Cubicles are anti-productivity, and yet we still build the shit out of them everywhere. I just don't. All right, so that was fantastic. Thank you very much. We're not going to be able to go through both of the next topics in any kind of detail, so I'm going to let you pick. Even though Edge is in the middle of my name practically, I'm gonna ask you to pick between topic 2 and topic 3, Edge or Multicloud. What do you want to spend time talking about today?
Look, they're both super important topics, obviously. I think with Edge, we can probably touch a little bit on multi-cloud as well too. So maybe we can go Edge, and we can kind of have a segment there as well too. So I say, with Edge being in your name, I don't know how I could choose not Edge, right?
All right. I appreciate that. I think for many, the onset of Edge is hard for them to capture, or capture may not be the right word. If somebody says they're coming out with a new car, you start seeing the cars on the road. And that's indicator of the fact that that car was produced and it was sold, right? And if you see a lot of them, then they're obviously popular. And that's an indicator of the value of that car in people's minds. With edge computing, while it's fairly accepted in general terms that edge computing is a big, valuable market, I think that there's a problem in the people that watch the market casually in seeing that edge is actually coming, because what they're looking for may not be what is actually happening today, or it may not be happening the way they expect it to happen. And that it's my convoluted way of getting to the point of, is edge coming? Is it just not recognized the way people are expecting it to be recognized?
Yeah, so I think a few things there. I think edge is probably further along than most people understand, because you don't get to see it as much as you would, to your point. When you start seeing Teslas around everywhere, you're like, oh, Tesla's doing well. There's more electric vehicles going on. And you see more electric vehicles come out because people start to insinuate that, oh, electric vehicles are a good thing, and it makes sense for me to be able to go out and spend my money on these things that are going to help us with sustainability and X, Y, and Z. Where I think, computer topology is a little more complicated than just being able to say, okay, yeah, so I see this, so it means it's there. And I think, edge is also, it's tough to really be able to define that. I know for a while we've been working on how do you even define edge, right?
Yep.
And I think wherever the information processing is located closest to the edge of that physical location, right? So we're talking about locations now. That's where things and people connect to that network digital world, right? And I think what we're seeing is there's a convergence of three things. There's a convergence of digital businesses that are happening at an accelerated rate now because of COVID.
Yep.
There's IoT that's happening again at an accelerated rate because of all the different things we're talking about when it comes to security and availability and all the things we're doing in a remote environment that needs to happen. Exactly, supply chain, 100%.
Yep.
And then there's these immersive types of things happening where we need to be able to be fully immersed in what's happening. And we're seeing that happen, supply chain, a bunch of other things happening as well too. But when it comes to I think it's more the augmented reality stuff. It's still not quite there, but you're seeing a lot of it in the generational, I think, consumerization of edge when it comes to, we're using this because it's something that we need to have as a byproduct for something else. And people don't realize what's powering that byproduct. Right. They just see it working and they're like, oh, this is cool. It works. This is great. So I think we're blurring the lines between physical and digital right now. And I think also new businesses are looking for real-time abilities to interact between people, business, and things, right? So edge is already doing a lot of that. I think the problem, though, to your point, is that I don't know what it is. There was a study somewhere. It said there's going to be 20 billion things, right, that are be connected by 2030, whatever it was, right? Yep. That's exponential order of magnitude growth that's happening. So whatever we think is happening today, by 2030, that's going to be happening at a much accelerated pace. Yep. So it's going to happen. I think the question people are still kind of understanding is where is edge? What is happening between these different edge and central core technologies? And where does it give value to the business to be able to say, okay, well, I need to do X, Y, and Z, because if I do that, I'm going to accelerate my time to market, or I'm going to accelerate my customer experience or my innovation. So I think that's where people are trying to figure out is they understand the technology to a certain extent. They don't understand how to actually drive that technology to have a sustainable business ROI.
Right. And I know I try to simplify things sometimes. Sometimes maybe inappropriately so, but I get the feeling that a lot of people are expecting to see, computers hanging off the side of their bicycle, or they're expecting to see, if it's somebody in our line of work, they're expecting to see small data centers on every street corner, that kind of thing, right? And edge, as I'm seeing it, and that's why I was asking you, edge as I'm seeing it, is hitting the market in 1,000 different ways already. But in most of those cases, that they're not invisible things. If you're not working on the factory floor for a particular company, or worried about the supply chain for a particular company, or developing better customer engagement processes for a company, there's no reason for you to even know or understand that Edge is being used in the creation, delivery, or support of the product or service that you happen to be engaged with. But it's, I think most people that are casually thinking about Edge, and this is just my opinion, is they're thinking, when do I walk down the street with a halo of the world floating around my head, and I can pick the movie that I want to watch from that halo, and I can order my food by thinking about it. And when I walk into a building, every room pops up and tells me what's going on in that room. You know, that's the kind of Edge that people are thinking about, I think. That's my impression. And that's still coming. I think a lot of the things that support that kind of capability are still coming. But I was just curious, and I know, you know, I have to be sensitive to, you know, what you can and can't talk about at Gartner, but are you seeing at least any broad themes from the large enterprises that you guys are working on areas? And you mentioned some areas already, but are you seeing some active efforts either on build your own or partnerships or whatever to build out Edge capabilities?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a hot topic right now, right? And I think it's one of those things where, you know, this is where we kind of talk about multi-cloud a little bit too. So you have the multi-cloud layer sitting above, whatever that enterprise data center is going to be, right? And then you have normally a regional, you know, CDN or some kind of telecom provider, colo provider doing something. And I think that's where people really want to understand, okay, so now that I have these two things that are working, like, you know, a decade ago, everyone was going public cloud, you know, and now 5 years ago, everyone was going multi-public cloud, because even though it's more expensive and more cumbersome and harder to manage, it gives you more flexibility, more things you can do. And now people are like, okay, I kind of mastered this public cloud thing, this multi-cloud thing, and now I'm trying to understand this regional DC. And that's where we start to really understand, okay, so like when you get to the local DC, because like the edge compute, as you know, it's going across regional, local compute, you know, all the different ways up to edge to get to device.
Yep.
Like, when should they get involved and when should they care about edge?
Right.
Because you can commoditize this and you can pay someone to do it.
Yep.
So the question isn't really like, hey, should we buy or should we not buy edge? It's like, when should I buy edge and when should I build it? And at what point is the right place for me to get involved with this? Right. And it's a hard, you know, question to answer, because I think for the most part, you can see it already working well at local DCs. I think compute edge, you know, like edge server, edge storage, you know, like that's already working pretty well. So then you start to get into like the gateway edge stuff and start to work on that stuff when it comes to like this, you know, access points and all the first hop stuff. Maybe, you know, but I think there's probably more value when it comes to the embedded PLC wearable stuff that you're working on, like the edge device layer. Like that's where I think you could actually customize that. And it kind of goes back to like, do you want to run your own cloud or do you want to buy cloud?
Right.
The answer is like, you want to buy cloud, and you can just leverage device edge and you can create something on top of that, you know, API connection. And you can essentially say, okay, I'm going to use that to connect people and things together. And I'm going to commoditize that aspect to be something that I can differentiate from my business to give me some kind of competitive advantage. Otherwise, if you're trying to do too many things, I think, and again, all this stuff's just my personal opinion, right? I think you're going to run into is just like, there's so many different priorities to be running all these things. And the team you have to have, the talent you have to run this thing, you know, long term, it's quite diverse, but also it's quite expensive as well too.
Right. I mean, that's the one of the levels of advice that I try to provide to people that ask about edge in general, and it's that like thinking about you know, a 5,000 or a 5 megawatt data center versus thinking about a 200 megawatt data center or a, you know, a 1 million square foot data center, is that scale does matter. Yeah. And scale in a specific location, as in vertical scale or horizontal scale, both come with significant new issues and considerations to make. And so, you know, even when you're thinking about, oh, I can run Kubernetes in 10 sites, that's not a problem. Well, maybe you can in 10 sites, but it completely changes when it's 250 or 1,000 sites. Right? It's very, very different.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, and I think what we're seeing with this, you know, work from anywhere is that, you know, you have the speed of light, law of physics things for the latency, right? So it's like, pre-COVID, the use cases I think were a little bit harder to say. This is definitely an edge use case. There's definitely edge use cases, but to say 100% edge use case, so obviously you're looking at things like latency, you're looking at things like data and bandwidth, privacy, limited availability to connections and autonomy and things of that nature. I think now what we've done is we converge all those into saying we need to work anywhere.
Yep.
So latency is huge for us. We're video to video right now, and if we weren't video to video with some kind of decent connection, it'd be hard for us to communicate in real time.
Right.
Bandwidth, again, data, high intensity bandwidth going back and forth, streaming 4K video.
Yep.
And then what it's come down to is privacy and security. It's it's one thing for a large enterprise to be doing, a lot of this stuff. Global, mega companies that are doing this across multiple different geographic dispersities over multiple different regulations and laws, that becomes much harder. So that's where the privacy and security helps a ton to be able to localize this stuff, make sure we have confidentiality. And then the whatever you want to call the other one, the limited availability or bandwidth or connection going down, not being something that we can handle as far as like SLAs, that's becoming much more needed as well too, especially in day-to-day communication between us. If you're down or I'm down with no bandwidth or any kind of connectivity for the entire day, we can't go to the office now. Right. I used to be able to drive 5 minutes down the road and I'd be at a local office. Now, what do I do?
Exactly. I'm going to an office that's an empty building that's been turned into condos or something now.
Exactly.
Helpful. And so 2 more questions on this, and then I hate to say it that we have to wrap up. I can't believe that 40 minutes has gone by already. The first one is, and please feel free to bring in the idea of multi-cloud again to this part of the subject as well, is what do you think the impact of regulatory laws around privacy and data protection are likely to do to edge or multi-cloud strategy for companies? Because if we can visualize a United States that has 7 or 10 or 15 different data protection zones, what if even 25 or 30% of the world decides to get to the point where you can't work or do anything that has any kind of personal information or country information and take it outside the borders? Right? Is that something that you guys are looking at all? Is that something that you personally see as a problem or an opportunity, as it were, for multi-cloud and edge?
Yeah, so I think there's always, chatter, what's going to happen when this happens, kind of mentality, or what's going to happen if this were to happen, or, scenario planning or role playing. And I think what it comes down to is, looking at it from a multi-cloud, edge native, kind of cloud out perspective, if you will. Like edge in kind of perspective is like, you're going to be using the ecosystem to make sure you have the right capabilities in place to do the things you just talked about, right? So you're going to have more horizontal portability and more distributed computing, which means you'll have better information gathering when it comes to being able to have better privacy, better communication, all the things you just mentioned when it comes to these different aspects.
Right. Cloud,
on the other hand, centralized, it's stable, right? But it's something that's more standardized and needs more location specific areas, and it's sometimes less ability to be able to transfer that information from geographical areas as securely as you would do from an edge network, depending on how it's set up, right? What you're using and all the different protocol setups, right? It gets complicated as you get down the rabbit hole. But just looking at it from face value, like edge will definitely be something that I think you'll be able to leverage from that perspective to give you better abilities to connect when it comes to looking at next levels of security integration and ability to actually have more portability when it comes to these different things. I think where we're still not sure what to do when it comes to these different things, as far as like, hey, what are next real business actions and outcomes, is that the functionality of latency, like I think some stuff, the 5G connectors have helped us accelerate some of this now. So it's like, do we still need some of the MEC stuff? And then there's better CDNs now for content delivery networks. So is that something I think as we develop different models, the use cases are becoming more mature as well too. So what really comes down to is when you're looking at it from a distributed business processing perspective, a device control and maintenance perspective, to your point, and like a client or, you know, an employee, you know, engagement or delivery perspective, like that's where all these things converge, in my opinion. And that's where we're gonna have to start solving these problems with some real technology that can actually become more of a clearinghouse, if you will, right, for these different functions. And I think as more people become, you know, willing and able to do these things, we're going to start seeing that happening at a much larger scale, much faster pace.
Yeah, I think that makes total sense. So Ryan, this has been fantastic. And before we end the session today, you know, pick a separate subject, something that's near and dear to your heart, or you know, mention something that's in the news, whatever. But what kind of closing comment do you have for somebody that might be listening?
Yeah, I was just talking to somebody that I mentor, you know, earlier today, and they said, "Hey, what can I do to really be able to drive my career?" And I said, "Really, you know, honestly, it's stretched beyond your own and mostly your employer's expectations." Right. I think everyone gets kind of stuck in this. Hey, I need to do these things. They get a little complacent, you know. And I think I was telling them, like, your comfort zone is going to give you a false sense of security. First of all, you got to push yourself to be a lifelong learner. And I think contentment is the enemy of success when it comes to actually changing things at scale and at pace that we're seeing across all these different industries right now. And as these systems, and they were asking me, so what do you think's going to happen in my role? You know, am I going to get outsourced? It's like, well, you'll get outsourced if you let yourself get outsourced, right? So systems, robotics, machines, all that kind of stuff's going to get smarter, but it's going to make you as a, you know, employee more capable as a human, better, faster. And if you stay relevant in these different mindsets and abilities, and I think with the right mindset of non-complacency, and the responsibility gives you the power to build your own future, you can closely align with your passions. I mean, it goes back to what we first started with. You can come into this field doing networking, coding, whatever it is. Like, those things are going to change, right? But as a lifelong learner, the more you increase your flexibility, the more dynamic the global economy becomes, based on what we talked about today. I think you're going to start to see people invent and reinvent themselves in a way that they never could otherwise. I think this economy today is setting people up to be able to do so. And it's not about just creating opportunity or job hopping. It's about ensuring that you can continue to provide benefits to your current position and to yourself as a valuable asset to propel innovation and drive value across the organization. I think people sometimes they get lost in the picture of, hey, I'm working on this one part of this one project and I'm being successful. It's like, yeah, but what are you doing big picture? And how is that going to change in the next 10 years to be able to drive the value in the organization? So top of mind, just something I was thinking of as we had a conversation.
I like it. I like it. I mean, and it's funny because I use when I'm talking to partners or vendors in this space, in the technology space in general, I use some similar logic, but I tell them to instead challenge their assumptions. Right. I mean, one of the examples I use is, you know, if Google were told, if Google needs to build 50 data centers this year around the world, which is an unusual expectation for them or Microsoft, and the companies that supplied generators to Google said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we can't get you generators for 2 years." What do you think Google would do?
Right.
Google wouldn't sit there and not build data centers. They'd figure out how to live without data centers. And so challenging, similar to what you just said, at a company level, but also at a job level, is challenging your assumptions. Do you really need all that stuff? Do you need to hit this many check boxes for X solution before you try to move on to the next? Is just because a new machine came in and it's doing a job that you used to do, does your job have to be only watching that machine, or could your job become someone who's helping to figure out how to use that machine in new ways that weren't anticipated when it was first brought on? Bottom line is that, at least my opinion of the bottom line, is that the speed of change for jobs these days is shrinking. Every year it's shrinking. So, you know, 50 years ago, if we were working in a small town in Central Oregon, cutting timber, and somebody said, "Oh, the timber business is going to go away," we probably could have stayed in our job and retired before we had to worry about it.
Right.
And then 30 years later, you know, somebody comes and tells you, you know, maybe the oil rig business is going to go away. if you were already in your 30s or 40s, you probably could finish your job working on oil rigs. Maybe not if you were in a coal mine, right? But now, coding languages to machines we use, to deployment strategies, to app design, to what's accepted as requirements for customers to use new tools. They require a whole new level on a regular basis of education, to your point. So I think that mentor advice is good, really good, and important for everyone to take into account that it's nice when your leaders try to help take care of you and offer you advice and suggestions and warn you about what might be coming. But in the end, we're all responsible for our own career.
Absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
if we don't own that responsibility, then we find ourselves on the curb wondering what happened. I was fine yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway,
100%.
Very good, Orion. And sadly, you're not as active on Twitter as you used to be, probably because you run half the world now. But what's a good way for people to keep up with you if they want to?
Yeah, I think Twitter's still great, so I think that's probably the easiest way. Unfortunately, I'm not as active as I used to be, but, keep coming with great content and I'll keep commenting on it as always. So I appreciate it.
Cool. And my advice is follow Ryan. And what's your Twitter handle, Ryan, for everyone?
It's just at Ryan C. Fay.
At Ryan. Okay. So folks, I recommend you follow him and be prepared, because he's not going to just give you bullshit answers. He's going to give you answers that challenge your assumptions, as I was just talking about. So excellent, Ryan. Thank you again for joining. It's been fantastic catching up with you and getting your opinions. And I'm positive that the audience will appreciate your take on this. So when I grow up someday, I'm going to be like you. Folks, that's it for today's podcast. If you feel like you have an interesting idea for content or for another podcast guest, please feel free to reach out to us. But thank you for joining, and until next time, take care.
Thank you for listening to the Edgevana Podcast. Be sure to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast listening app or on YouTube. To learn more, visit www.edgevana.com. Thanks for listening, and be sure to join us on our next episode.